Defenseless old woman robbed by gang, but Messi saves the day. Maria walked carefully through the narrow streets of Buenos Aires, clutching her small purse tightly against her chest. The evening air carried a mix of scents: freshly baked bread from a nearby panaderia, grilled meat from a distant parrilla, and the faint aroma of strong Argentine coffee wafting from a cafe down the street. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, but Maria barely noticed. She was tired. Not just from the long day, but from the weight of everything. The slow, creeping loneliness of old age, the quiet indifference of a city that had once felt like home but now felt colder. She had lived in Buenos Aires her whole life. She had walked these streets when they were different, when people greeted each other, when neighbors cared, when a helping hand was always near. But now, people rushed past her without a second glance. The world had grown faster, and Maria had become just another invisible old woman. She adjusted the strap of her purse and took another slow step forward. It wasn't much, just a small cloth bag containing her medication, a loaf of bread, a few pesos, and a faded photograph of her late husband. She had carried that photo for over 30 years, keeping it close like a treasure. Tonight, as she walked home from the pharmacy, she felt a familiar unease creep up her spine. The streets had emptied. Shadows stretched long across the pavement. She wasn't alone. She heard the footsteps first, too many, too close. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She clutched her bag even tighter, willing her old legs to move faster. A voice rang out behind her. "Where do you think you're going, Abuela?" Maria froze. Slowly, she turned. 3 men stood behind her, young and restless, their eyes glinting with something she had seen before: hunger, cruelty, boredom. She swallowed hard. "Please, I don't have much." Tallest of them, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, grinned. "We'll be the judge of that." Before Maria could react, his hand shot forward, grabbing the strap of her purse. She held on. Her old bones screamed in protest, but she wouldn't let go. "Let it go, Vieja," the second man muttered, irritated. Maria's fingers tightened. "No, a mistake." The third man, broad-shouldered and impatient, shoved her hard. Maria stumbled backward, her frail body hitting the ground with a painful thud. The cold pavement bit into her skin, her hands scraping against the rough stone. Her purse was ripped away from her grasp. She gasped, watching helplessly as they tore through it, laughing at the few pesos, carelessly tossing aside her medicine. Then one of them found the photograph. Gar turned it over in his fingers, his smirk widening. "What's this?" "Your long-lost lover." Maria reached out desperately. "Please." Gar ripped it in half. A sound escaped her lips, something between a sob and a sharp intake of breath. The world tilted. Not because of the pain in her body, but because of the pain in her heart. It wasn't just a picture. It was her last piece of him. The laughter continued, cruel and careless, as the torn pieces of her past fluttered to the ground. And then, they stopped laughing. A heavy silence settled over them. Maria, still on the ground, clutching at the pavement, noticed the shift. The air changed. A new presence had arrived. A voice, deep and calm, cut through the quiet. "Pick it up." Maria looked up. And so did they. Standing just a few feet away, bathed in the golden light of the street lamp, was Lionel Messi. For a moment, no one spoke. Gar's smirk faltered, uncertainty flickering across his face. The second man muttered under his breath, nudging his friend. "No way." "That's..." The third man's fingers twitched. "Messi." Messi stood still, his eyes locked onto them, his expression unreadable. Then, he took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. Gar scoffed, trying to mask his nerves. "What, you gonna dribble past us?" Messi didn't blink. "The photograph," he said, his voice calm but unshakable. "Pick it up." The words hung in the air. A challenge. Gar let out a short, forced chuckle. "For what?" Messi tilted his head slightly. A small gesture, but deadly. Kind of shift that happens before a game-winning goal. The kind of shift that meant everything was about to change. Gar hesitated. His confidence, once unshakable, now wavered. Because he recognized something in Messi's eyes. Something that said, "I'm not asking." Silence stretched. Then, Gar moved. Not forward. Backward. And that was it. The moment he stepped back, he had already lost. Gar swallowed hard, then crouched down, picking up the torn pieces of the photograph with shaking fingers. He placed them on the ground gently, almost as if afraid to touch them. Messi didn't break eye contact. "Now go." Gar didn't argue. Didn't try to be clever. He just turned and walked away. The other two followed, their shoulders tense, their once mocking laughter now gone. Messi stood still, watching until their footsteps disappeared into the night. Then he turned to Maria. For the first time since he had arrived, his expression softened. He bent down, carefully gathering the torn pieces of the photograph. His fingers, so often known for their precision on the field, now moved with care, with gentleness. Maria watched, her breath shaky, as he placed the pieces in her trembling hands. Her voice cracked. "I don't understand." Messi met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "No one should go through that alone." Maria felt something break inside her. Not from fear, but from the weight of being seen. Tears welled in her eyes, her fingers curling around the torn photo. "They took everything," she whispered. Messi's jaw tightened. No, his voice was like stone. "They haven't." Maria held her breath. Because there was something in his eyes. Something that told her this wasn't over. And somehow she knew. Lionel Messi wasn't done yet. Maria sat there, still trembling, the torn photograph clutched in her frail hands. The world around her felt distant, as if she had been dropped into some dreamlike space where things like this didn't happen, where famous men like Lionel Messi didn't walk out of the night to defend an old woman like her. Her breath came in uneven gasps, her chest rising and falling as she tried to process everything. Messi watched her carefully. His stance was relaxed, yet his presence was unshakable. His eyes drifted to the scattered remains of her belongings, her medication rolling near the curb, the few crumpled pesos lying in the dirt. Without a word, he bent down. Maria blinked as she watched him gather each item, slowly, deliberately, as if these small things mattered just as much as the trophies and medals he had lifted 100 times before. He picked up the bread, dusting off the crumbs from the pavement. He reached for the medication bottle, making sure the lid was still tight before placing it back in the bag. Then, he crouched in front of her, holding out the purse as if it had never been touched by those thieves at all. Maria stared at him. Her lips trembled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Messi's gaze didn't waver. "Because they were wrong," he said simply. The words hit her differently than anything she had heard before. Because they weren't just about the stolen money. They weren't just about the torn photograph or the pain in her knees from hitting the ground. He wasn't just saying those thieves had been wrong to attack her. He was saying the world had been wrong to ignore her. Maria pressed a hand over her mouth, fighting back the tears that burned behind her eyes. For years, she had learned to expect nothing. Not kindness. Not fairness. Not a hand reaching out to help her off the ground. But now someone had stopped. Someone had seen her. And that someone was Lionel Messi. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the purse, but before she could take it, Messi shifted slightly. His eyes flickered downward, to the torn pieces of the photograph still in her lap. Maria followed his gaze, swallowing hard. "It's ruined," she murmured. Messi was quiet for a moment. Then, with careful fingers, he reached out. Maria watched as he gently took the pieces from her, lining up the jagged edges with surprising precision. It was just a photograph. But to her, it was everything. Messi turned it over, studying the creases, the torn seams. Then, he did something Maria didn't expect. He pulled out his wallet. For a brief second, she thought he was going to hand her money, but instead, he slid out a thin, clear plastic sleeve. Inside was a small, slightly worn photo of his own family. His wife. His children. He carried it everywhere. Messi removed the plastic sleeve and, with steady hands, slid Maria's torn photograph inside. The transparent cover held the pieces together perfectly. Then, he handed it back to her. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She traced the edges of the sleeve with her fingers, stunned. Her husband's face stared back at her from behind the protective layer, still torn but whole in a different way. It wasn't perfect, but it was saved. Maria looked up at him, her lips parting in disbelief. I don't know what to say. Messi gave a small, almost boyish smile. Then don't. For a moment, Maria forgot who he was. Forgot the cameras, the stadiums, the millions who worshipped him. 'Cause right now, he wasn't Lionel Messi, the global icon. He was just a man who had stopped for her. A man who had refused to let the world treat her like she didn't matter. A fresh tear slipped down her cheek. Messi reached out, offering his hand. Maria hesitated. She hadn't accepted help from anyone in a long, long time. But tonight was different. Slowly, she took it. His grip was firm but careful, steady but gentle. And when he helped her to her feet, Maria realized something. She wasn't just standing. She was standing taller than she had in years. Messi picked up the small plastic sleeve with the photo and placed it gently inside her purse, making sure it was tucked safely away. Then he met her gaze. "Let's get you home." Maria exhaled a shaky breath. She had spent most of her life believing she had to do everything alone. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she let someone walk with her. The streets of Buenos Aires were still alive with the hum of city life. The soft glow of shop signs flickered in the distance. The murmur of conversations drifted through the air, but Maria didn't hear any of it. She only heard the steady sound of Messi's footsteps beside hers. She clutched her purse close, not out of fear this time, but because it carried something precious again. Messi walked beside her in comfortable silence, his presence calm, reassuring. It wasn't often that Maria had company on these walks home. And certainly never company like this. As they reached her building, Maria hesitated. This wasn't a moment she wanted to end too quickly. She turned to Messi, searching for the right words. "Why did you stop?" she finally asked. Messi looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Then, with a small, quiet smile, he answered, "Because someone had to." Maria felt something warm settle in her chest. She had spent too many years feeling invisible. But tonight, she knew without a doubt, she had been seen. And that was something she would never forget. Maria stood at the entrance of her small apartment building, staring at Messi with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The quiet of the street around them made everything feel surreal, as if the events of the night hadn't really happened. Yet, in her trembling hand, she still clutched the purse, the newly protected photograph of her husband tucked safely inside. Messi had walked her home without hesitation, his presence steady, protective, and yet so casual. As if this were just another ordinary night for him. As if stopping to help an old woman was as natural as breathing. She swallowed hard, her voice unsteady. "You really didn't have to do all of this." Messi tilted his head slightly, studying her. His lips curved in a small, easy smile. "I know." Maria let out a soft breath, shaking her head. "People don't just do things like this anymore." Messi's smile faded slightly. "They should." His words carried weight. Maria didn't know much about football, but she knew enough to understand that he wasn't like other men. She had seen him on the news, in the newspapers. He was a legend, a hero to so many. But now, standing here in the dim glow of a street lamp, she saw something else. A man who hadn't forgotten what it meant to be human. She let out a tired chuckle, though there was warmth in her eyes. "You remind me of my husband." Messi raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh." Maria nodded, gripping her purse a little tighter. "He never let people walk home alone either." Messi smirked at that, but there was something softer in his gaze now. Maria exhaled, shaking her head. "I wish I could repay you somehow." Messi shrugged lightly, as if the thought never even crossed his mind. "You already did." Maria frowned. "How?" He nodded toward her purse. "You trusted me." Maria blinked. She hadn't thought about it like that. She had spent so long keeping her head down, keeping her distance from the world, expecting nothing from anyone. But tonight she had allowed someone in. She had let him help her. Messi shoved his hands into his pockets, looking toward the quiet street. "I should go before someone recognizes me." Maria chuckled softly. "You must be good at disappearing." Messi smirked. "I've had practice." She glanced toward the empty road, her heart suddenly heavier than before. She didn't want him to go, not because she needed him to stay, but because for the first time in years she wasn't afraid to walk these streets anymore. And that feeling? She wasn't ready to lose it just yet. Before he could step away, she reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against something small but meaningful. Then, with careful hands, she pulled it out, a small silver cross on a delicate chain. She had owned it for decades. It wasn't worth much, but it had been hers. A symbol of faith, of endurance, of something greater than herself. She held it out to Messi, her lips pressing together. "For you," she said softly. Messi's brows furrowed slightly as he looked at it. "Maria, you don't have to." "I know," she interrupted, repeating his own words back at him. "But I want to." Messi hesitated, then, with careful hands, he took the chain from her. His fingers brushed over the cool metal, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, he slipped it into his pocket. "I'll keep it," he murmured. Maria smiled. "Good." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Messi took a step back. "Take care of yourself, Maria." Maria nodded, warmth spreading through her chest. "You too, Lionel." Messi smirked at the use of his name before giving her a small nod. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the quiet of the Buenos Aires night. Maria stood there for a long time, staring after him, the city suddenly feeling different than it had before. It wasn't brighter. It wasn't safer. But she was. She pressed a hand over her purse, feeling the small photograph inside, knowing it had almost been lost forever. Then, with a quiet breath, she turned, stepping into her building, her heart lighter than it had been in years. 'Cause tonight she had learned something important. She wasn't invisible. She never had been. And now, she never would be again. Maria closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, taking in the silence of her small apartment. The dim glow of the kitchen light cast soft shadows against the walls, making everything feel smaller, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her purse on the table, carefully pulling out the small plastic sleeve Messi had given her. Torn photograph inside was still broken, the edges jagged where it had been ripped apart by those men. But now it was protected. Saved. She traced her fingers over the image, her husband's face staring back at her as if nothing had ever happened. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't from fear or sorrow. This time they were from something else. Something warm. Something she hadn't felt in years. She took a slow breath and walked to the small shelf in the corner of the room, where a handful of framed photographs sat, memories of a life long past. Some of the pictures had faded with time, but they were still there, still part of her. She placed the plastic sleeve carefully beside them, as if returning it home. Then, her gaze drifted to the table, where the small silver cross she had given Messi had once rested. She smiled softly, knowing it was now with him. She hoped he would keep it. Not because he needed it, but because she wanted him to have something to remember tonight by. A reminder that, for all the stadiums and trophies, all the goals and victories, this night had mattered too. Maria sat down with a tired sigh, her body aching from the fall earlier, but her heart lighter than ever. She reached for her tea, the cup still warm, wrapping her hands around it as she stared at the quiet night outside her window. Tomorrow, she would go back to her usual routine. She would walk to the market. She would greet the shopkeepers. She would pass the children playing football in the alleyway. But everything would feel different now. 'Cause she knew something she hadn't before. The world hadn't forgotten her. It had just been waiting for her to believe in it again. And all it took was one man who refused to walk away. Maria closed her eyes, exhaling deeply. And for the first time in a long time, she slept without fear. The next morning, the city was alive as always. Cars honking, people rushing through the streets, vendors calling out their daily specials. The familiar chaos of Buenos Aires hummed around Maria as she stepped outside, the sun warm on her face. She adjusted her scarf, gripping her purse a little tighter, not out of fear but out of habit. As she walked, she saw the same faces she always did. Neighbors, shop owners, the boy from the bakery who always stacked the bread too high. But something had changed. Or maybe she had. She walked with confidence, no longer keeping her head down, no longer feeling invisible. When she passed the cafe at the corner, she noticed a group of men reading the morning paper, murmuring in excitement. She caught a glimpse of the front page. There, printed in bold letters, was a headline. Maria's heart skipped a beat. A small, grainy photo showed Messi, standing in the same dimly lit street where everything had happened last night. The article mentioned a defenseless old woman who had been saved. Maria smirked. She supposed that was her. The men in the cafe argued back and forth, some saying they didn't believe it, others defending him. "He's always been like that," one of them said, sipping his coffee. "Humble kind." "Yeah, but he didn't have to do it," another countered. "Most people wouldn't risk getting involved." Maria paused at the entrance of the cafe, her lips twitching into a knowing smile. She could have told them everything. She could have told them that yes, it was true. That Messi had been there. That he had not only stopped those men but restored something deeper inside her. That he hadn't just saved her purse. He had saved her faith in people. But instead, she simply stepped inside and ordered a coffee. Let them argue. Let them wonder. She knew the truth. And that was enough. As she sipped her coffee, she caught a glimpse of a television screen behind the counter. Footage from the previous night's game played, showing Messi weaving through defenders, scoring a goal so effortlessly that the stadium erupted in cheers. Maria watched, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. The world saw him as a legend, a genius with a ball at his feet. But Maria? She saw something more. She saw the man who had stopped when no one else had. And as she finished her coffee, folding her hands neatly over her purse, she thought to herself, maybe it was time to start watching football after all.